At my own retirement party, standing by a sheet cake with my name misspelled in blue icing, a colleague I'd worked beside for 11 years pulled me aside and asked if I was really going to do it. I said yes, I was. She lowered her voice the way people do when they think they're being kind instead of frightening and said, "Patricia, aren't you scared? A woman? Alone? Down there?" I remember smiling and saying something breezy, something about how I'd be fine, and then driving home afterward with both hands tight on the wheel, because the truth was I hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks, and her question had just put a name to the exact thing keeping me awake. I am 71 years old, and I want to tell you honestly, before I tell you anything else, that I was terrified. Not nervous, not hesitant, terrified, in the specific way that sits in your chest at 3 in the morning and doesn't leave when the sun comes up. I had spent months planning a move to San Miguel de Allende, a colonial town in the highlands of central Mexico that I'd fallen in love with through videos and photographs, and I had spent an equal number of months lying awake, convincing myself I was about to do something reckless and possibly fatal, entirely because I would be doing it by myself. I should explain who I was before any of this started, because I don't think I'm the person you'd picture as terrified of anything. I taught orchestra and choir at a public middle school outside Portland, Oregon, for 34 years, which means I spent 3 decades keeping a room of 12-year-olds with sharp instruments and sharper opinions from injuring themselves or each other. A job that does not go to the faint of heart. My husband, David, died of a brain aneurysm when I was 49, sudden and complete, gone on a Thursday morning making coffee, and I raised our 2 children the rest of the way through high school and college largely on my own, on a teacher's salary, in a house I kept because I refused to let one terrible morning take everything. I am, by any fair account, a capable woman. And still at 71, the idea of getting on a plane by myself and building a life in a country I'd never visited had me Googling crime statistics at midnight like they were going to talk me out of my own dream. I think it's worth being honest about where that fear came from, because I don't think it came from nowhere, and I don't think the women watching this who feel the same way are being foolish. It came from decades of headlines about cartel violence that never once distinguished between one region of an enormous country and another. It came from well-meaning family members forwarding me articles with subject lines like, "Please read this," before you decide anything. It came from being a woman who'd spent 71 years absorbing a general, low-grade cultural message that the world outside familiar borders is dangerous for women traveling without a man. A message so constant I'd never fully examined whether it was true, only inherited it the way you inherit a grandmother's china, without ever asking if you actually wanted it. So I did what I do with everything, which is research it properly, the same way I used to research a piece of music before I'd let my students touch it. I read the actual State Department advisories, not headlines about them, and discovered they're issued state by state within Mexico, not for the country as a whole. And that Guanajuato, where San Miguel sits, carried one of the lowest advisory levels in the entire country, the same level as several regions of Western Europe. I found expat forums specifically for women moving alone, hundreds of them, women in their 60s and 70s and even 80s, describing lives that sounded nothing like the danger I'd been bracing for. I read about San Miguel's specific reputation, a town that's drawn single American and Canadian women for decades, enough of them that the ratio of women to men in the expat community there is famously lopsided, which I found strangely comforting, the mathematics of it. If this many women had gone before me and stayed, the story I'd been telling myself couldn't be the whole story. My son Peter, who lives in Boise and has always been the more anxious of my two children, did not take the news well at first. He sent me 3 separate articles in 1 week, each with a different alarming headline, and called on a Sunday to ask, carefully, whether I'd considered that this might be what he called a grief thing. Even though David had been gone for 22 years by then, and grief, whatever it was doing to me, had long since stopped being the freshest explanation available. I told him it wasn't grief. I told him it was the opposite of grief, an appetite for something I hadn't let myself want in longer than I could remember. He wasn't fully convinced, but he stopped sending articles after I sent him back a spreadsheet of my own, comparing violent crime rates in specific American cities to the specific municipality of San Miguel de Allende. Numbers that made his chosen city of Boise look, on paper, considerably less safe than the one he was worried about. He didn't have much to say to that, which from Peter is its own small victory. I booked a 10-day scouting trip for that October, alone, which felt like its own small act of defiance. My daughter Emily, who lives in Seattle, called me the night before I flew out and asked, one more time, if I wanted her to come with me. I told her no, gently, because some part of me understood that if I let someone else hold my hand through the first trip, I'd never fully trust myself to have made this decision on my own. She didn't love that answer. She loved it even less 3 days later, when I didn't answer a text for 6 hours, because I'd been at an outdoor concert in the Yarden, San Miguel's Central Plaza, with no signal and, for the first time in longer than I could remember, no particular urgency about checking my phone. I want to tell you about that first evening, because it's the moment I trace everything back to. I'd landed in Len that afternoon, taken a shared shuttle the hour and a half to San Miguel, and arrived at my rented casita just as the light was turning that particular gold color the town is famous for, everything glowing pink and orange, the parochia's spires catching the last sun above the rooftops. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, and still carrying that low hum of fear I'd flown in with. I decided to walk the 4 blocks to the Jarden anyway, mostly because staying inside felt like letting the fear win before I'd even given the place a chance. The plaza was full. Families on benches, teenagers gathered in loose clusters, an older man selling roasted corn from a cart, mariachi drifting faintly from somewhere I couldn't see, and threaded through all of it, women my age, walking alone or in pairs, sitting alone at calf tables reading, one woman doing needlepoint on a bench beneath the laurel trees like she had nowhere else on earth she needed to be. I sat down near her, not intending to talk to anyone, just wanting to watch for a while. She glanced over, noticed my slightly stunned tourist expression, and said, without much preamble, "First time?" Her name was Dorothy, from Michigan originally, 78 years old, and she'd been coming to that same bench most evenings for 11 years. I asked her, carefully, if she ever felt unsafe, walking home alone after dark. She laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Honey, I feel safer here at 10 at night than I did in my own driveway in Michigan in broad daylight." Then she went back to her needlepoint, as though she'd answered a question so simple it barely warranted the pause. That didn't erase the fear entirely. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories that resolve too cleanly aren't useful to anyone. I still walked home that first night, checking over my shoulder more than once, still locked the casita's door, and then checked it twice more before I could fall asleep. Old habits built over 71 years don't dissolve in a single golden evening in a plaza, however lovely the light. But something had shifted, a small crack of doubt in the certainty of my own fear, and over the following 9 days, that crack widened, evening by evening, into something closer to trust. By the end of that scouting trip, I'd walked home after dark more nights than not. I'd eaten dinner alone at 3 different restaurants without once feeling like a curiosity. And I'd had 2 separate strangers, a shopkeeper and a taxi driver, go out of their way to make sure I got where I was going safely, unprompted, the way you'd look out for a family member rather than a customer. I flew home to Portland, and within 6 weeks had sold most of my furniture, given notice on my rental, and booked a one-way ticket back. Emily met me for coffee the day before I left and asked me, one final time, if I was sure. I told her I'd never been less sure of anything, and never more certain I needed to do it anyway, which she said made no sense, and which I told her was the most honest sentence I owned. She hugged me for a long time at the airport, longer than either of us was probably comfortable with, and told me to call the moment I landed. I called 4 hours late, because I'd gotten swept into a conversation with my new landlady, a woman named Rosario, who insisted on walking me through the entire neighborhood, introducing me to 3 different shopkeepers by name, before she'd let me settle into my new home. I moved to San Miguel permanently that January, alone, 71 years old, into a small casita on a cobblestone street 10 minutes from the Jardin, with a rooftop terrace where I could see the parroquia's spires turn gold every single evening if I remembered to look up. I won't pretend the fear vanished the moment I unpacked my bags. There was a night in my second week when a dog barked for what felt like hours somewhere down the street, and I lay in bed running through every worst-case scenario my imagination could produce, before I finally got up, made tea, and sat on my terrace until the sky started lightening, feeling foolish and exhausted and, underneath both of those things, still there. The turning point, if I can call it that, came about 2 months in. On a Tuesday evening in February, I'd gone to a lecture at the public library, one of the many English language talks that happen constantly around town, and stayed later than I'd planned, deep in conversation with 2 other women about a book we'd all apparently read. By the time I left, it was past 9, dark, and the walk home took me down a stretch of street with fewer lights than I liked. My old fear rose up immediately, that familiar tightening. And then I noticed I wasn't walking alone. 3 other women from the lecture, all headed roughly my direction, had simply fallen into step beside me without either of us suggesting it. The way people naturally cluster when a walk needs company, chatting easily about the lecture the whole way, peeling off one by one at their own front doors until it was just me and Carmen, a retired nurse from Texas, who walked me the final block specifically because, as she put it without any drama at all, that's just what we do here. That's just what we do here. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else from my first year in Mexico, because it wasn't a special arrangement made for the new, frightened American woman. It was simply the fabric of how this particular community moved through its evenings, a quiet, unspoken agreement among women that nobody walked the dark stretch alone if somebody else was heading that way too. I hadn't found safety by being careful in the way I'd always understood carefulness, locked doors and tight schedules and constant vigilance. I'd found it by joining a community that had already built the vigilance into itself, collectively, so that no single woman had to carry the whole weight of it alone. If any of you are sitting with that same fear right now, the one that kept me up at 3 in the morning for months, I want you to comment below and tell me what worries you most. Because I read every single one of these, and I think a great many of us have been carrying the exact same quiet dread without ever saying it out loud to another living soul. I've been in San Miguel for nearly 2 years now. I take a Spanish class on Monday and Wednesday mornings with a group of 6 other women, all of us mangling the subjunctive tense together with a shared good humor that makes the mangling feel almost like the point. I volunteer twice a month at a music program for local children, teaching recorder to 8-year-olds in a church hall, which after 34 years of orchestra classrooms felt less like starting something new and more like coming home to the one thing I've always known how to do. Tuesday mornings I walk to the Mercado Ignacio Ramrez, where a fruit vendor named Lupita has learned exactly how ripe I like my mangoes, and sets a few aside before the morning crowd arrives. A small kindness that took me nearly a year to fully register as unusual, because by then it had simply become part of how my week was shaped. My rent runs 12,000 pesos a month, roughly $650, for a casita with that rooftop view I still haven't tired of. My groceries and eating out combined come to around $280 a month, and a full dinner at one of my favorite spots near the Jardin runs about $9. My monthly expenses altogether settle around $1,400, comfortably covered by my teacher's pension and Social Security, with room left over for the occasional trip to Guanajuato or Querétaro that I never would have budgeted for back home. I still lock my door. I still check it twice some nights, out of habit more than fear now. But the specific terror I carried on to that first scouting flight, the one my colleague named at my retirement party without meaning any harm by it, that particular fear is gone, replaced by something closer to the ordinary caution any sensible woman carries anywhere in the world. Emily visited this past spring, and I watched her do exactly what I'd done. Walk the Jardin that first evening with her shoulders slightly raised, glancing over her shoulder more than necessary. By her third night, Dorothy had claimed her for needlepoint lessons on the bench under the laurel trees, and I watched my daughter's shoulders come down, slowly, the same way mine had. On her last night, we sat on my rooftop terrace watching the spires catch the last of the light, and she said, "Mom, I was so scared for you." I don't think I ever told you how scared. I told her I knew, that I'd been just as scared for myself, and that the scared part of both of us had simply been wrong about what this place actually was. She asked me if I regretted anything about coming alone. I told her the truth, which is that coming alone was the entire point, not because I didn't want company, but because I needed to prove to myself, at 71, that the woman who'd raised 2 children by herself and kept a house standing after the worst morning of her life was still, underneath the fear, exactly as capable as she'd always been. I was terrified to move abroad alone as a woman. I want you to know that the terror was real, and I'm not going to tell you it was silly or that you shouldn't feel it if you're feeling it right now. What I will tell you is that the fear and the reality turned out to be 2 entirely different things, and the only way I ever discovered that was by walking toward the thing that frightened me, instead of away from it. I think about that colleague from my retirement party sometimes, the one who asked if I wasn't scared, standing there under the fluorescent lights of a school cafeteria with cake on a paper plate in her hand. I ran into her once at a conference back in Portland the year after I'd moved, and she asked, almost shyly this time, whether it had really turned out the way I hoped. I told her it had turned out better than I'd hoped, because I hadn't known, standing at that retirement party, how much of my own life I'd been living small out of a fear I'd never actually tested against anything real. She didn't say much to that. She just nodded, the way people do when something lands somewhere they weren't quite braced for. Dorothy is still on her bench most evenings. I join her now, most Thursdays, with my own needlepoint I never expected to take up, in a town that turned out to be safer and kinder and far less lonely than the empty house I left behind. I'm Patricia Carter. Thank you for listening to Women Choose Mexico.